Today's reading is Luke chapter 15, verses 1 through 32, which is the entire chapter. So don't go to sleep on me. This is the story of the errant son. All the tax collectors and sinners were gathering around Jesus to listen to him. The Pharisees and legal experts were grumbling, saying, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Jesus told them this parable. Suppose someone among you had 100 sheep and lost one of them. Wouldn't he leave the other 99 in the pasture and search for the lost one until he finds it? And when he finds it, he is thrilled and places it on his shoulders. When he arrives home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, "Celebrate with me because I have found my lost sheep." In the same way, I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who changes both heart and life over 99 righteous people who have no need to change their hearts and lives. Or that woman, if she owns 10 silver coins and loses one of them, won't light a lamp and sweep the house, searching her home carefully until she finds it. When she finds it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, "Celebrate with me, because I have found my lost coin." In the same way, I tell you, joy breaks out in the presence of God's angels over the one sinner who changes both heart and life. Jesus said a certain man had 2 sons. The younger son said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the inheritance." Then the father divided his estate between them. Soon afterward, the young son gathered everything together and took a trip to a land far away. There he wasted his wealth through extravagant living. When he had used up his resources, a severe food shortage arose in that country, and he began to be in need. He hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. He longed to eat his fill from what the pigs ate, but no one gave him anything. Then he came to his senses and he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have more than enough food, but I'm starving to death? I will get up and go to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Take me on as one of your hired hands.' So he got up and went to his father. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion. His father ran to him, hugged him, and kissed him. Then his son said, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quickly, bring out the best robes and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Fetch the fattened calf and slaughter it. We must celebrate with the feasting, because this son of mine was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his older son was in the field. Coming in from the field, he approached the house and heard music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what was going on. The servant replied, 'Your brother has arrived, and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf because he received his son back safe and sound.' Then the older son was furious and didn't want to enter in, but his father came out and begged him. He answered his father, 'Look, I've served you all these years, and I never disobeyed your instruction. Yet you have never given me as much as a young goat, so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours returned after gobbling up your estate on prostitutes, you slaughtered the fattened calf for him.' Then his father said, 'Son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we have to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found.'" The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So I struggled a little bit with whether to start this sermon with a "you've been warned" kind of statement, because even though I haven't really issued formal warnings about my preaching per se, I feel like regular attendance in worship here ought to at least count as your implicit acceptance of the fact that I'm probably going to pull you off the beaten path, especially when we're considering parables. And for those of you who might be visiting for the first time or the first few times, well, let me just begin by saying, after hearing that, you probably are in for an unexpected take on some of the sayings of Jesus. Well, you've been warned. You see, here's the deal, and Eileen was right. I wasn't trying to mask that it was the entirety of chapter 15 by listing the verses, but it was. And Luke's parables today present us with a conversation that is worth exploring, and honestly, they really fit nicely into our 21st century, born into the Christian faith ways of thinking. Because as we read it that first time, it might sound like common sense Christianity 101 type stuff. God is love. God loves us. And Jesus is throwing us a bone by preaching to the choir this morning. But you already know that's not exactly the case now, don't you? After all, I did warn you. So let's start at the beginning and then work our way forward. The lost sheep parable seems pretty straightforward. Our shepherd God goes out in search of the lost and brings them home. It's pretty much straight out of Amazing Grace, the lost being found and so forth. But before we all start humming those lyrics in our head because we think it would be rude to interrupt the preacher by bursting out a song as if we're all in a made-for-TV musical, which would actually really be fun if you guys did that. Let's do something that's a little more like a investigative drama TV instead and ask the less obvious question. What about those other 99 sheep? Aren't they basically now free for the taking while their defender is off searching for the straggler? Now, I'm no rancher, but in a world full of wolves and other hungry animals that eat sheep, leaving the whole flock to fend for themselves while looking for a single solitary straggler does not sound like a very smart move. And it gets worse. The story tells us that after finding the lost sheep in a fit of sheer joy or what must have been temporary insanity, the shepherd hoists that sheep up on his shoulders and heads home to celebrate with his friends. It had better been a take this job and stow it kind of party. Because even if the flock doesn't end up at its own Last Supper, when the owner finds out how this all went down, that shepherd is so never working again. From what I can tell, by the time this parable is finished, whatever cause the shepherd had for celebration should probably be replaced by some well-earned existential dread. Because one way or another, this story is not going to end well for him. But if we think things are going to get any clearer with the parable of the lost coin, well, we might as well go party with the shepherd. Because when we avoid the temptation to hear this through the simple logic of being some faith allegory, it also turns pretty messy pretty fast. We're used to hearing this as another straightforward, Amazing Grace kind of story of our Mother God rejoicing over the recovery of that one lost coin. But like the previous parable, the ending should provoke more questions than it answers. In this case, the financial stakes are at least a little lower. The silver coin that the woman has lost is probably worth about a day's wages, nowhere near the value of an entire flock of sheep. And she doesn't have to put the rest of her finances in jeopardy to turn her house upside down in search of that coin. But her choice to celebrate feels just as confusing as the shepherd's. You see, the unspoken thing that we might not be as attuned to as 21st century listeners that we kind of approached in the children's message there is that celebrations usually involve the trappings, in this case, a meal. And a meal means the woman will undoubtedly incur some expense. And that one lost coin, it seems unlikely that it alone would cover the cost for a celebration involving friends and neighbors. In fact, if the woman in this parable isn't careful, she could end up spending a hefty portion of her original 10 coins celebrating the recovery of the misplaced one. And while recovering 1/10 of one's wealth would certainly be cause for celebration under other circumstances, to turn around and shell out more than the value of that single recovered coin to throw a party in its honor leaves me wanting to feel that woman's forehead to check for fever. So now we have a mess, but we've got that clear-cut case of the parable of the prodigal to clean it all up, right? Yeah, huh? Sure, it's another amazing grace kind of story, where that wretched sinner of a younger son is welcome home after wasting his inheritance and moral standing in a life separated from God, but only true if we stop reading at verse 24 and ignore everything that happens after that with the older brother. And we'd still need to reckon with the fact that the only reason we're willing to be a little judgy about the older brother and accepting of the extreme generosity of the father is that we are pre-programmed to go ahead and assume that the father character is our God of unending love, and that the older brother is the Pharisee and or scribe, a character that we never play as people of faith. So you finally got that. So where we might see this as a simple story where we can all relate to that younger brother, there are plenty of hearers in Jesus' day who would have been able to identify with any of the three of these characters, and probably even knew some real-life examples of the people who had behaved or were even still behaving badly in the world around them, overturning their social conventions through acts of selfish, insulting, and disrespectful behavior, which makes the father's choice to respond to selfishness, insult, and disrespect with love, compassion, and kindness, simultaneously thought-provoking and infuriating. While they might rightfully want to ally with the older brother and punish that upstart jerk of a younger brother, they may also recognize Jesus' point that the only way to interrupt this potentially unending chain of failures of relationship is not to dole out punishment with what is considered appropriate, socially sanctioned retribution, but to throw out all of those expectations that they bring to this story and respond instead with acts that are loving, compassionate, and kind. And this is where I can't stress enough just how radical this solution needs to sound and feel for us to truly understand the heart of what I think Jesus is trying to get at. Because he's offering these parables in response to the question of why he eats with tax collectors and sinners. They're the upstart younger brothers in this parable that these snot-nosed older brother scribes and legal experts are trying to insist that Jesus must punish. And his answer is instead to point out to them that he has no need to come seeking them, the people already in and around the temple, for they've never truly been, or at least fully been, isolated from God or neighbor. But these tax collectors and all of those who have been labeled and pushed to the margins under that blanket epithet of sinners, well, they're the ones who need to experience the love of a shepherd God who will abandon the entire flock in search of just them. They need to know that they're so important to their mother God that she would spend 5 times what they would ever be worth in the entirety of their one lifetime just to celebrate their return home. They need to hear that even if their isolation from the community was, like the younger brother in today's story, their choice and not chosen for them, they need to know that they'll be welcomed back regardless of all the judgmental folks who've been hanging around Dad's place the whole time. Now, maybe you already know who some of these folks are today. The ones who have been pushed away by so many, by too many of our institutions of faith. At one point, it was divorcees, particularly women, particularly single mothers. And in some of our houses of worship, it still is. At another point, it was people who married across racial lines and challenged our uncomfortable history of racial supremacy and segregation and today continued inequality. And in some of our houses of worship, it still is. At still another time, it was women who felt the call to lead their communities of faith, only to learn that they would not be welcomed. And in some of our houses of worship, it still is. And at another time still, It was the people who realized that they love someone whom the church expects or even requires them not to love, or that the gender they've been socially assigned or perhaps even implicated in by their own bodies or even their DNA fails to meet the expectations of their church, but also of themselves. Well, you know how this sentence ends too. And in some of our houses of worship, it still is. There are so many missing coins out there, so many lost and struggling sheep, so many, too many, that we have declared to be prodigals. Not because their journey led them away from us, but because we forced them not to journey with us, or simply made sure they no longer wanted to journey with us, whether through overt pressure or what we might have thought was at the very least benign neglect. And yet, there are communities out there embracing this revolutionary message of Jesus. Communities that have realized that the celebration of God's love that we experience together is far more valuable than the supposed cost of the search, just like the mother God and the shepherd God we might find in our first two parables. And there are communities out there that realize that we're not denying sin, but rather denying love when we choose to be the older brothers standing on the outside of God's celebration and looking in, pretending that we're defending the walls of the church when we're really just manning the bulwarks of our own prejudice and pridefulness, too often without even taking the time to wonder why we even defend these unneeded barricades at all. Now, I hope you won't hear too much judgment in my words, because I fully recognize that any scorn that works its way into this message falls on me as much as anyone. I have suffered through, or rather I should probably say I've been insufferable as I lived through my own periods of self-righteousness that included some racial bigotry, but more particularly a fairly virulent homophobia that I worked so hard to pass off as piety. And I've since lived through my moments of being deeply ashamed, hoping and trusting that the pain of acknowledging my sin, of usurping God's judgment in order to decide the sinfulness of others, that one day, out of that pain, I would find healing. And with time, my shame has come to transform me. And it has allowed me to embrace my call as a follower of Jesus to not only atone for my literally disgraceful past, but also to accept the way of Christian ministry, knowing that part of my call is to continue to invite all of us into atonement for our histories of disgrace, of ungraceful behavior that, like the older brother, tempts us to live outside of God's desired community, even as we delude ourselves into thinking that we're the ones guarding the gates to the kingdom. I had a lot of words I was prepared to share today, to talk about how our bent toward reading these parables in ways that are ultimately self-serving rather than other-serving, that ultimately tempt us to self-righteousness rather than God's righteousness, about how these safe, common-sense readings of the text keep us from embracing the uncommon sense of the good news of Jesus Christ. Now, I had a bunch of other words about why our reluctance to embrace the good news has, and I have no doubt in my mind that this could be true, not least of all because I think it might have been one of my reasons had I been staying home. But how this bent towards judgment and gatekeeping has helped keep so many who have quietly exited out the back doors of our churches from having any desire to make their way back. But I realize that I've already asked us to take a pretty hard look in the mirror as it is. So I'm going to shift gears and get to the sermon title that, admittedly, I penned before I fully realized where this message was going to land, and wonder for a moment, just what do we have to lose? Here again, I had a few cutesy sounding turns of phrase lined up for this too, including one that particularly tickled me about losing that extra weight we've been carrying around as a chip on our collective Christian shoulders. But instead, I want to share a quote I've seen floating around on the internet recently and then ask us once more, what have we got to lose? So these words are from Barbara Brown Taylor, an author, brilliant preacher. I studied her sermons as part of my coursework in seminary, and an ordained Episcopal priest who in her recently published book wrote the following. And Jeremy, can you cue that up? Thank you. She wrote, "The only clear line that I draw these days is this. When my religion tries to come between me and my neighbor, I will choose my neighbor, because Jesus never commanded me to love my religion." We've certainly had our problems with religion along the way, haven't we? And maybe even had our problems with our love of religion. And yet, when we embrace the kind of love that tells us it's not about what we've lost, and that might include our understanding of our religion, but rather that we need to give up the things that separate us from God, from one another, and from doing God's will, like giving up the entire flock to find the one, or spending lavishly to celebrate the recovery of a small sum. When we embrace the kind of love that comes with the realization that the only thing keeping us on the outside of God's feast is our own need to draw boundaries, well then, do we even need to spend a lot of time caring about what we've got to lose? Because in the act of letting down our unneeded defenses, and of letting God handle the judgments and the sortings that we think we need to hold on to, in all of that, we might just discover that rather than having something to lose, we may instead have everything to gain. Amen.